Hello, protocols, packets, and programs, and goodbye, 2024. What a year we've had with software that's gone a bit bad. Exeutils gave us some thrills. CrowdStrike gave us some chills. We covered AI and vulns of all kinds. Maybe next year we'll talk about secure defaults and designs. Which means this week we chat with Hannah Sutor about managing identities, deciding defaults, and caring about UX. Stay secure and stay tuned for Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production for security professionals by security professionals. Please visit securityweekly.com/subscribe to subscribe to all the shows on our network.
It's the show to learn the latest tools and techniques to understand DevOps, applications, and the cloud. Your trusted source for the latest AppSec news. It's time for Application Security Weekly.
AI is transforming applications, but with innovation comes new risks. Enter Noma, the first application security platform built to secure the entire data and AI lifecycle. From your AI supply chain to models and runtime, Noma protects it all. With a single platform that integrates seamlessly across your data pipelines, Jupyter Notebooks, ML Ops tools, code, and application SDKs, Noma delivers full lifecycle visibility, security, and compliance. Start securing your data and AI lifecycle at securityweekly.com/Noma. This is episode 311, recorded December 16th, 2024. I'm your host, Mike Shima. I'm here with John Kinsella. Hello, John.
Mike, I'm trying to figure out if this year's gone by really quickly or really slowly.
This episode is going to go by really quickly or really slowly as well. So let's find out. Because I'm also happy that I think it's going to go by with some fun, because we've also got Kalyani Pawar with us. Hey, Kalyani, good to see you.
Happy to be here after a long time.
And you're just in time to help us close out the year. Also helping us close out the year is Hannah Sutor, who's passionate about all things digital identity and security and balancing security and usability. She's currently a principal product manager at GitLab, focusing on authentication and authorization in a DevSecOps context. Hannah has spoken at various conferences on digital identity, privacy, cybersecurity, and DevOps workflows. She's a participant in OpenSSF working groups and serves on the board of ID Pro. Hello, Hannah. Thank you for joining us.
Hey, Mike and crew. Nice to be here.
Happy to have you. I did mention, we're closing out the year, and one of the things that we haven't talked about enough, I think, is identities, credentials. We'll check it later on this segment if you've rotated your password this year. But one of the focuses that you work on is non-human identities and handling that. And we live in the world of the internet, and I guess we have to clarify that non-human doesn't mean cats, but it possibly means other types of services that are possibly as difficult to wrangle. So,
does this have to do with the drones over New Jersey?
Let's find out. Yeah, Hannah, non-human identities. We've come up with some ideas. What exactly does this mean?
Yeah, so at least to me, anyway, day to day, we sort of, whenever I first started at GitLab in my position, it was a lot about, password policies and users and sessions and SAML and LDAP and things like that. And I feel like the narrative has really shifted. And it's kind of like that stuff is figured out now, sort of standardized, and we feel good about it. But what about all of these other credentials and things that are going on behind the scenes and have access, sometimes even much more privileged access than necessarily a human? So these are things like services, or there are other things like credentials that are attached to a human user, but maybe represent them in a slightly different way. So maybe they have a lot more scopes and privilege than a user, and we issue them one time, and then there's not really good visibility around them. We're not sure that they exist. We're not sure what they can access. And so this has really become sort of my focus, maybe the past year or so, is I think from a security lens, people are saying, okay, we feel like we have a good handle on our human identities with the advent of things like identity providers that sort of centralize all of that and give you a view into it. But what about all the other credential types? And some of those too are not necessarily subject to the same security flows like multi-factor auth as a human. So if you have something that's running an automated process, right? We can't say, oh, it's been 24 hours. We're going to need your OTP code, right? Like, lest everything stop. So a lot of times they aren't subject to the same security scrutiny as the human identity as well.
Yeah, and one of the best backdoors into any system is just valid credentials, and that's why we have phishing. That's why we have lots of initial access brokers who are trying to steal cookies out of browsers, because you can go through, as you said, that OTP process or even passkeys, but once your browser gets that cookie that identifies you, it's a great thing to replay. So why not go after services? And you mentioned 24 hours, maybe re-challenge for an OTP. That starts to touch on the idea of defaults. And I think you come from the perspective of a SaaS, a service provider, kind of deciding what some of those defaults perhaps could be or maybe should be. How do you go through that thought process to figure out, this is what should, I'll frame it as, benefit everyone, or perhaps this is what's going to annoy everyone because it's a default suddenly people will have to work around?
Yeah, this is a really challenging issue, and I'd say I've learned a lot just in the past year. So in general, right, GitLab is a platform. We want you to be able to sort of take our platform, bend it to however you want. I often think of my team as sort of providing a toolbox that an administrator can then use to say, this is how I want to balance like security and usability, and choose for themselves how they want to do security with GitLab. Right. But we've signed the CISA Secure by Design pledge. And that's really given us sort of a new like oomph to take a look at what are the defaults we're providing in our platform and making sure that they're the more secure version, but still allowing our customers to opt out. And I think a way that I feel good about this, at least at the moment, because disruption is a huge thing, right? And our platform underpins, software factories, automotive factories, mobile phone providers. Like, there's a lot of impact whenever we disrupt something. Yeah. So I think a way to think about this that we're currently kind of using as a guiding principle is that if you install GitLab today, you're going to have those secure defaults. But for those that already have it installed, we're not going to necessarily force that change of that secure default on you. So I think that's kind of like a nuanced take, and something that's come out of some learnings we had earlier this year about expiring tokens.
Yeah, that does seem, you never want to surprise users, right? What for any reason. I'm curious about, some of those, as we're talking about credentials, just as kind of a general recommendations, advice, you talked about like maybe rotation, or what about privileges? Are there certain things that you would recommend? I know not everybody's building their own IDP, et cetera, but could you just maybe walk us through what some of those defaults, what those choices are, and maybe how you came about to them?
Yeah, sure. So one we're considering is for anyone that uses our out-of-the-box authentication, which at this point is not even the majority, especially of enterprise customers, because so many use an IDP now. But we do have our own built-in authentication where you can use a set of GitLab credentials to log in. We're looking at, we started out by saying, okay, people should be forced to have MFA, right? And that sounds good in theory. But then whenever we started walking through kind of the implications of that, our free tier, we don't provide support for account recovery on our free tier. And we have a lot of free users, right? So we then were like, well, how great is the user experience then if we're like, hey, you have to do this, but then you get locked out and we provide you no way to recover. So kind of going from there, we said, what is the biggest security impact we can have, right? Because that's ultimately what we're trying to do here with the smallest amount of disruption. And the way we're going about this at first is enforcing multi-factor on admins first. So they automatically have a lot more privilege than your regular old user. So we're going with admins first, seeing how that goes and rolling that out that way. Another secure by default type of thing that we have looked at and did is that we had a problem with token leaks a couple years ago, where we were paying out a lot of bounties to hackers who found leaked tokens. And we kind of all came together and said, okay, what can we do about this? Because if we're having this problem because we dog food our own product, then probably our customers are also at high risk of leaked tokens. So how can we make sure that when or if a token is leaked, it is lesser of a security issue than it might have otherwise been? And of course, we do have secret detection, which goes out and looks for leaked secrets and revokes them automatically. But it's still an issue. So we kind of came together and said, today, you can have secrets, tokens that you create that can have a lot of scope, and they can also live indefinitely. So we looked at that and said, we're going to give our customers a bunch of warning, like a 1.5 year warning, but we're going to enforce an expiration date on any token that doesn't have one. So we said, as of this date, we're going to run a database job that's going to expire your tokens in a year. And then we had some notifications set up. We did a blog post like, hey, tokens can't live indefinitely anymore. This is security best practice. You're going to need to rotate them. But it turns out that our communications were not sufficient for that. So we had a lot of customers who never got the email, right? Maybe it went to the wrong person. Maybe it went to spam. We also found that our rotation that we provided was not full featured enough to expect customers to be able to rotate. Some were not comfortable rotating with an API and wanted a UI option. And we ultimately ended up on our self-managed product. We were able to provide an opt-out for the expiry. So it was a big lesson learned in that if you're going to force something like this on your customers, there needs to be, I'd say the number one takeaway is that the communication needs to be absolutely on point. And we had a lot of hard lessons about communicating with our customers in this.
Yeah, I was curious about that because there's this, you're a product manager, so you have that background. You're going to know immediately, talk about personas, that type of thing. And I think I think it would be too dismissive or easy for me just to say, you talk to security folks and developers. It sounds like there's probably lots of types of developers that this communication outreach needs to talk to. I guess in the sense of just emailing more or more blog posts, what are ways or some of those lessons learned about that communication in the sense of what did you try to change in terms of different either venues of communication or just the way you framed why you're doing this in the first place?
I think, we relied too much on the blog, right? And to say we all consume so many applications every day. And it is too much of an ask to be like, subscribe to our blog, keep an eye on our blog updates. Like a blog shouldn't be what drives keeping your system from breaking, right? So we can't expect that of our customers. And I think previously it was like, if we have a deprecations and removals process, we put this through the process, we checked every box, right? Like on paper, we did everything right. But this was the most disruptive change we had pushed out in a long time, just in terms of the scale. One thing we could have done is measured. We didn't have good telemetry into how many tokens are we going to actually be expiring on a day. I think if we did, we would have said, maybe we don't expire that many tokens on the same day. Maybe we roll it out, right? Instead of doing it all at once. Our support folks, I can't tell you how many times I've apologized to what they had to go through on that day when all of the expirations hit at once. It's also been a forcing function now, I think, for some things that really needed to happen. So we've now added a new impact calculator to our deprecations process where you have to go through a little quiz and give a sense of how impactful this deprecation and eventual removal. So any breaking change has to go through this now is going to be on the customer, and it gets a score. And then based on that score, it kind of follows a different communication pattern. And it's also forced a revival of something we've known we should do for a long time. And that's in-app notifications. It's one of those things that's always just been pushed, deprioritized, right? We have more burning fires. But if we had in-app notifications, we wouldn't have had to rely so heavily on email. and we would have had yet another way to contact our customers. So that's something that's been revived as a priority as a result of this.
Yeah, and I think that, I don't know that even just getting a TikTok influencer is another strategy for supplementing that block. But as you're describing like that UX impact checklist, that brings to mind that idea in the CISA Secure by Design pledge, taking ownership of customer outcomes. Now, I think it's not exactly the same as a security consequence, but I think it's related in spirit. And I want to ask, based on that, what was it like to go back to even your developers and rather than have a security checklist for them to go through, have a user impact, a user experience checklist? Was that a different conversation than we got to do this because otherwise we'll be insecure, we'll be hacked, et cetera, versus we just need to do right by the customer? I'm just kind of curious about how that conversation goes because I don't know that AppSec has that kind of conversation enough.
Yeah, I think it's really important. So I'm the one that did actually check the boxes for the customer impact checklist, but not without consulting, right? Both my engineering team and our AppSec team. And I think it forces the AppSec team to think through sort of the impacts of what they're recommending. And I feel very fortunate because our AppSec team is really great about having it be a conversation. And, sometimes it's like, if it's a certain ranked vulnerability, it's like, well, regardless, we've got to do this, right? But they're really great about understanding the nuance in how disruptive certain changes, gem upgrades that have a breaking change, things like that, impact our customers. And then oftentimes how we do it is like, okay, maybe we can make part of the change that gets us like 90% of the way there, but doesn't close that final 10%. But it preserves usability. And then we usually end up dividing the remaining 10% out into like a longer tail effort where we can make the breaking change further down the line, have customers maybe opt into it on their own, and they can get that experience to make sure nothing's going to break on their end before we force it on them. So really bringing them into that conversation, helping make sure, here's how I understand the customer impact to this. Do you agree or do you see it differently? Really helps.
That's neat. And I think that's one of just my personal soapboxes that I just wish, as a follow-up comment more than a question, that more AppSec teams had those kind of conversations about centering the user. And I think that you're getting Kalyani's attention on this topic too, perhaps.
I was more so about like CISA Secure by Design. I thought of a better scenario-based question for you here, pertaining to most of the people that I talk to are usually startup founders who built like their first MVP product and they're scaling, just got their first rounding funding and they're scaling, trying to add in more features. And so my question to you would be, what would be like the top things that they should keep in mind when they're, scaling their product from an identity management perspective? Because often we're talking about security and velocity a lot in the whole dynamic. And while they're also building an MVP or have gone beyond an MVP, they want to ensure that they have that basic layer of security baked into their product. And so what would be your top, takes for them?
I think we're at kind of an interesting point in identity where before there was sort of like, hey, if you're like a heavy engineering company and you might need, certain off-the-wall identity use cases, build your own. And now I think the conversation has changed to like the vendors have such good tools that can get you up and running with identity so quick. And then they're the ones on the hook, right, for patching and keeping things up to date, such a vital part of your product. So I guess to a startup, I would say don't try to build your own, go with a vendor solution that's out there. And I'm not one to typically say that kind of stuff, but offerings are just so strong. They're fully featured. They have very high expectations of them with so many different companies running on these vendors these days. So I'd say there's no need to roll your own off.
Related to that idea of, Kalyani's asking about, related to that CISA Secure by Design, in the past with talking to any SaaS, they ask for, hey, do you have a SOC 2? Do you have this ISO? Then list of whichever numbers are important for this year. if somebody, do you foresee a future where someone will come and ask, can we see your, have you signed the pledge? Or what would you hope a year from now, or maybe 6 more months from now, after a year of a bunch of companies like GitLab and several others, I think there were 70 or so that signed it. What would you hope to see as an outcome that shows this is what we did in response to this pledge?
Yeah, I think I've seen a great tool for this already. I'm sure you're all aware, but it's newer to me, is the Trust Center. I think most companies, put a public, like, here's our Trust Center, and you can go and kind of view all of their certificates about their security posture. So I guess what I'd hope for is just another, I forget how it's displayed, but like another, window or panel there that says, maybe not only we've agreed to implement CISA Secure by Design, but like, here's the things that we've done. Like, check. Here are the things that are secure by default. And so how that translates, because I'm in product, I'm always thinking to, how does that translate to customer value, right? So it would be like, avoid disruption later by having secure defaults now. Obviously, your security posture is improved. And then perhaps you save some money on security resources, because now we don't need to expect our platform engineers to be experts on how to secure GitLab. Like, it already comes out of the box with this much security built in, right? So that would kind of be I would hope that the customers are seeing the value out of it beyond just the box that's checked.
And so it's in part of the reason we're hitting you with these questions around this, Hannah. We were talking about the Secure by Design pledge on the show last week in the news. One more question. We'll probably switch topics, but I'm curious from your point of view as a product manager. What type of feedback have you been getting from your customers? Or were they eager to hear about this? Have they been asking questions about it, or has it been sort of crickets? Or what? Beside the fact that you guys have embraced it internally, what's been the sort of customer-facing view?
I know our CISO, has a very public, persona where he does a lot of interviews and he does a lot of customer visits. And I've heard from his team that this is something that's consistently asked about. I think the customer segment I get is slightly different. It's more of like your everyday user practitioner. And so they're not necessarily as concerned with secure defaults as much as they are with just wanting to use the platform in the most efficient way. So I can't say I've heard it as much from the customer segment I serve, but I've heard through the CISO org that this is very much a conversation in that part of the business.
Interesting.
Yeah, and I think one of the things you talked about too was, again, a little bit about that communication in terms of like a trust center, and here's what we're doing related to the pledge, which I do like that sense of transparency you described in terms of we're doing something different. We've made this change, or we're doing these defaults, so you don't have to spend, your platform engineers don't have to spend that week just hardening whatever the tool is, whether it's GitLab or something else, because after they bought it, it's just working. I want to tie that into also GitLab, like many other companies, you're not unique here, has had vulns in the past. But what stood out too was, as you mentioned, like the CISO, the security team has been pretty transparent about what happened. And I thought that was pretty nice to see as a like leading by example for a company like GitLab to do this. And I'm curious, again, what your view, because you see the product, you see perhaps different customers, not just AppSec folks talking to AppSec folks saying, yay, thanks for telling us, details. What does it look like to actually go through that wrangling of being transparent about what's happened when, potentially it's kind of embarrassing, or it's, it doesn't feel good?
Yeah. That's a journey. My team had the worst vulnerability in GitLab history, and it was almost a year ago. So it was in January 2024. And we are a very transparent company. It's one of our values, and we do almost everything in public that we reasonably can as a public company at this point. But you can go in our issue tracker, you can look at anybody's comment history, you can probably get a great sense of what I'm working on from day to day just by looking at my profile and seeing all my comments. So we're very open, and very little of what we do is actually behind any kind of like confidentiality gate. Of course, due to the nature of this CVE, we had to work confidentially, but the entire time the intent was to disclose publicly as soon as we can reasonably get our customers into a place where once we did disclose publicly, that they wouldn't be at risk anymore. So there was a big effort behind the scenes. We did a ton of different communications to our customers where we kind of said, hey, we put together a patch release. We said, hey, we really, really, really urge you to take this release. But we couldn't say exactly why, right? At the risk that even telling a customer, the wrong eyes could see it, somebody could go exploit it somewhere else. So that was frustrating, I know, for our customers, because applying a patch release with us, trusting us to say it's really important that you do this, it's not always trivial, especially if you're self-hosted. Our SaaS customers, we could patch them, right?
Sure.
So that wasn't what we were worried about. It was getting our self-managed customers, and especially those that are behind, right, on upgrading. Because now suddenly we're asking you to hurry up and get up to date with the most recent patch release. And for some of our customers, this involves downtime, coordinating multiple teams. So it's not a light lift. Now, some of the security risks are mitigated on self-managed too, if you're sort of like, in a black box and you're not publicly exposed to the internet. So that there's trade-offs there too with security. But really communicating to our customers, making the patch release the easiest we could to install. We backported the patch. That's another thing we did to make it easier for customers. We backported it a lot of versions. So even if you were on one of those older versions, rather than having to come up to date, you could take the patch for an older version. And when the time was right and we felt that we had done everything we could to get our customers in a good place, obviously, we have some telemetry into that. We also involved our customer success team, who did, hand reach outs to customers and said, please upgrade. We publicly disclosed, and I still remember, working with our communications person. We were like bracing for impact, and it did make headlines, and you can find those headlines. There was a Bleeping Computer article. There was a couple other articles. And I still remember on Hacker News, there was this whole thread of, GitLab has this really bad CVE. And the number one most upvoted comment was like, wow, it's really rare to see a company actually do this kind of disclosure.
Yes.
And so props for transparency. And then our application security team did a video, which I believe Mike will link to in the comments here, the show notes, of what this vulnerability was, how we fixed it, and then how we made sure that something like this doesn't happen in the future. So I think that was even an extra step of transparency, where we kind of said, okay, this really sucked for us, but we hope that other people can learn from it.
Yeah, and I think, and I will. It's only about a 7-minute video, so I'm real quick, real easy to watch. And one of the things I wanted to highlight, what you said at the end there, part of the transparency wasn't just this is what happened. We created a patch. There was also that follow up of kind of that root cause analysis and what we're going to do differently, rather than just say this one type of patch. If it happens again, where it's more of we're preventing this type of problem from cropping up again as much as possible. And, Kalyani, I don't know if this also makes you think of something as well.
I did think about that exactly. And I was also thinking about this whole, aspect of transparency. It's so nice to see someone being transparent about their, the issues that they had and how they were fixing it. So I was just curious to hear your take on just transparency in general and how, you could leverage GitLab as a code to make that change in culture in different organizations.
I love our transparency value. By nature, I'm a transparent person, and maybe overly so sometimes in terms of my bluntness. So I think it fits well with, my personal values. And we get, I think, from the product side, I don't have to try too hard to get customer feedback. That's a good and a bad thing, by the way. But, I've worked at other companies where it's so hard to talk to customers and you have to jump through hoops. At GitLab, I open an issue. I say, hey, here's what I'm thinking. Do you have any feedback on it? And people come out they're interested in what we're working on. And so they'll come out of the woodwork. And I remember, even for this token stuff, credit to the community who keeps an eye on what we do. We put the breaking change in to say we're going to enforce expiration on tokens. we had maybe like 30 downvotes. We have emoji voting. We had a lot of people being like, please don't do this. And I remember we're like, I know it's going to suck, but security, right? That was like what we said. Yeah. And now I'm like, next time, if I were to propose a change and I was getting that much customer feedback, I would take a harder look at it. Like, I shouldn't have brushed it aside. So I love our transparency. It's very helpful to me as a product manager. It does have some downsides. People can get angry and tag you, on issues if you're not working on their stuff. They say this bug is 4 years old. Why haven't you touched it? I'm like, look in our backlog. I think we have 2,000 4-year-old bugs. So anyone can open a bug in GitLab, right? That's also part of our transparency values. So anyone can create one. So that's good and that's bad, right? Because it creates a huge backlog for us. But it's pretty easy to see what things rise to the top as far as having a lot of customer interest. I did want to mention too, on that video, if you watch it, you'll see, but that video I was talking about, and we say this in the video, like that merge request that introduced that critical vulnerability had an AppSec review and went through all the AppSec checks. So it just goes to show how it can happen to anyone, even if you check all the boxes and do everything right.
Part of that transparency as we get to the end here, Hannah, is also just you've been public yourself. And one of the things I wanted to check on was where can people go to see or hear more about what you're doing over in 2025?
So in 2025, I'm excited. I do a lot of speaking, but I will have my first ever keynote next year at AuthCon. It is a new authentication conference for the CIAM practitioner, and it will be New York City in May. And ID Pro, I will give a plug for them if you're anywhere interested in identity. We have an amazing community. I write sometimes as a board member for the blog and the newsletter. That's idpro.org. And my personal website is hannahsutor.com. I've published some articles I've written there, podcasts I've been on, talks I've given. So that would be another good source.
That's awesome. And we'll make sure to keep a track of that in the show notes. And one final question, Hannah, as we close here. One of the things I wanted to bring back that listeners may be familiar with in 2023 is describing AppSec in 3 words. So I wonder if I pitch that over to you, no other constraints, no other rules. What 3 words come to mind if I say AppSec?
For first one is important. It's very important, and being in authentication and authorization, it's critical to our part of the product. Nuanced, like I mentioned, there's nuance there between like fix it, but also like how much benefit do we get from the impact that it could potentially have, and thinking about that. And then the third is negotiation. Along a similar line, I feel like AppSec is not always black and white. In certain scenarios, it is. But a lot of times there's a negotiation to be had around AppSec.
That is, negotiation is definitely a new one. So we're going to have to see what kind of FBI agents we can get there.
I don't know.
No, I think that's great. I want to say thank you once again, Hannah, for joining us. This was a great conversation to have to wrap up 2024. And I'm so glad that congratulations on hanging out to keynoting for the first time. Hopefully that will be a great way to start 2025 for you.
All right. Thank you very much.
I want to say thanks to Kalyani and John, and thanks to everyone else who's been listening. We're going to take a quick break and return with news of the week.